There are mysteries that captivate the world not because of their scale, but because of their intimacy. Not wars or disasters, but a single life, small, quiet, and utterly forgotten, that somehow refuses to stay buried. The story of the girl in the crystal coffin is exactly that kind of mystery. For years, she lay perfectly preserved beneath the streets of San Francisco, sealed in an airtight iron and glass casket, undisturbed while the city above her changed beyond recognition. Construction workers broke ground on her in 2016 and uncovered something that stopped them cold. Inside that small metal box, untouched by time in a way that defied all reason, was the body of a little girl. She was dressed in white lace. Flowers rested across her chest, and absolutely no one knew who she was. The world would come to call her Miranda Eve, a temporary name given to a temporary mystery. But she was not temporary. She was real. She had a family, a history, a name. It just took more than 100 years, modern genetic science, and the careful work of researchers across multiple institutions to give those things back to her. What they ultimately found was not just an identity. It was a tragedy. The kind that belongs not only to one child or one family, but to an entire era when death came quickly and children died quietly, and grief was buried along with the ones who caused it. This is the story of how that mystery was finally solved, and why the answer broke hearts all over again. To understand how a child could be found beneath a garage in a quiet San Francisco neighborhood more than a century after her burial, you first have to understand what San Francisco did with its dead. In the early years of the city, cemeteries were practical necessities, located close to the populations they served. But the gold rush of 1849 changed everything. Tens of thousands of people flooded into San Francisco almost overnight, transforming a modest settlement into a booming, overcrowded metropolis. Space became desperately valuable. The land occupied by graveyards began to feel, to city planners and developers, less like sacred ground and more like wasted opportunity. Over the following decades, city officials made a series of decisions that would strike modern observers as almost incomprehensibly callous. The dead were to be relocated, wholesale. The cemeteries that had grown up across San Francisco's neighborhoods were to be cleared, and the remains transferred south to a small town that exists today almost entirely for this purpose, Colma, California. Known today as the City of the Dead, Colma holds more than 1.5 million buried souls within its limits. Its living population numbers barely 1,500. Among those interred there are famous names: Wyatt Earp, William Randolph Hearst, but most are ordinary people, ordinary families, lost to history. The physical process of this relocation was enormous, imperfect, and deeply human in all the worst ways. There were no machines sophisticated enough to scan the ground for what lay beneath. Workers used brass rods, pushing them into the earth at intervals, reading the soil by feel alone. Skilled laborers could distinguish between a solid casket and loose soil, between a grave that had already collapsed and one that was still intact. But they could not account for everything. Graves buried deeper than expected. Graves that fell just outside the string lines they used to mark their search areas. Graves with no markers, no records, no one left to claim them. In a relocation involving hundreds of thousands of bodies, even a small error rate meant that some people stayed behind. The city moved on. Streets were built. Houses went up. Children played on lawns that covered graves. And no one knew. That is almost certainly how Edith Cook was left behind. Her small iron and glass casket, sealed against time, sat undetected beneath what would eventually become a residential neighborhood in San Francisco's Richmond district, the ground where Oddfellows Cemetery once stood. While her family likely believed she had been moved to Colma with everyone else, she remained exactly where she had been placed on October 15, 1876, 2 days after her death. And she would remain there for more than 80 years after the cemetery was gone. The homeowner was named Erica Carner. She and her family were away in Idaho when construction workers remodeling her property made the discovery. They found the casket buried beneath the garage, airtight, sealed, intact. What was inside was almost impossible to comprehend. The body of a small girl, preserved to a degree that should have been impossible after more than 140 years underground. She wore a white lace funeral dress, still holding its delicate shape. Across her chest lay a small floral cross. The flowers faded, but their form still clear. Her blonde hair rested gently, where it had been placed by hands long since turned to dust. Even her skin, though changed by the passage of time, had not fully decomposed. The casket's airtight seal had held perfectly. The cool, stable conditions of San Francisco's soil had done the rest. The casket itself was a remarkable object. Measuring only 37 inches long, built for a child, it was constructed from cast iron, with 2 glass panes set into the lid. These windows were intentional. In the Victorian era, such coffins were sometimes called crystal coffins, and they served a specific purpose: to allow mourners a final view of the deceased without unsealing the burial. They were rare. They were expensive. Families who chose them were generally those who could afford to express their grief through craftsmanship, through beauty, through the particular Victorian obsession with death as something to be memorialized rather than hidden. The girl inside had been loved. That much was obvious. Every detail of her burial, the dress, the flowers, the coffin itself, spoke of care and tenderness, of a family that had taken time to say goodbye properly, to honor a small life with as much dignity as they could manage. She had not been forgotten at the time of her death. She had been mourned deeply. It was only afterward, in the chaotic machinery of a city relocating its dead, that she had been lost. The discovery made news immediately. The image of a small girl behind glass, preserved by time and sealed metal, captured something deep in the public imagination. People couldn't look away. Her story felt both ancient and immediate. A life interrupted, a mystery suspended, an unanswered question pressing up through the floor of an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood. The family who owned the home found themselves in an unusual position. Officials informed them that they were legally responsible for arranging her reburial. Erica Carner also shared something else, something stranger and harder to explain. Before the coffin was found, she and her family had heard sounds in the house. Footsteps. The light, quick footsteps of a child. On at least 2 occasions, she and her husband heard them clearly enough to stop and listen. Their daughters were never the source. The sounds were never explained. After the body was removed, workers in the home reported hearing the same thing. Each time, they searched the house. Each time, they found nothing. Erica spoke about it without fear. She described whatever presence had been there, if there had been one, as gentle, friendly. Her words were those of a woman who had made peace with something she couldn't fully understand. She hoped, simply, that once the little girl was identified, once her name was known, once she was found again, she might finally be at rest. The body's remarkable preservation meant that researchers had access to something almost never available when investigating a century-old mystery: biological material. Hair samples were collected. This was delicate, exacting work. The genetic material had degraded significantly over more than 100 years, breaking down into short fragments of DNA, each only around 50 base pairs long. Working with material this old requires clean room conditions, strict contamination controls, and the same protocols used in the analysis of ancient human remains thousands of years old. Even a stray strand of modern DNA could contaminate and ruin the results. Scientists at the University of California, Davis, and later UC Santa Cruz undertook the analysis. What they found, step by step, began to paint a picture. Nuclear DNA confirmed that the child was female, consistent with everything else that was known about her. Then mitochondrial DNA analysis, which traces genetic inheritance through the maternal line, placed her in a haplogroup most commonly found in the British Isles. In the context of late 19th century San Francisco, with its large populations of British and Irish immigrants, that detail fit perfectly into the historical record. But DNA alone couldn't explain everything researchers needed to understand. They also turned to stable isotope testing, an analysis of nitrogen isotopes preserved in the hair that can reveal changes in diet and nutrition over time. What the isotopes showed was devastating. In the final months of her life, the girl had experienced severe nutritional decline. Her body had been deteriorating, slowly, gradually, for approximately 3 months before her death. This was not a sudden illness. It was a long, painful process of a body unable to sustain itself. Old funeral records had listed her cause of death as marasmus, a 19th century term for extreme undernourishment, often the result of a chronic underlying illness that prevented proper absorption of nutrients. The isotope data confirmed it. She had suffered. Whatever had taken her had done so slowly, and her family had watched it happen and been powerless to stop it. Even with this information, there was still no name. To get that, researchers needed living relatives. Genealogical research had already narrowed the field. 2 families with children buried in Oddfellows Cemetery during the 1870s had been identified as possible matches. Investigators reached out to living descendants from both families. They explained the mystery, the history, the stakes. Some agreed to provide DNA samples for comparison. The results were unambiguous. The genetic connection between the preserved child and one living man, a man named Peter Cook, was not marginal or suggestive. It was long, continuous stretches of shared DNA, the kind that indicates a recent common ancestor. This pattern is called identity by descent, and it points unmistakably to family. Once the DNA match confirmed the Cook family connection, historical records became a roadmap. Cemetery logs, birth and death records, family lineages traced through generations. Every thread led to the same place, to the same name. The girl in the Crystal Coffin was Edith Howard Cook. She was the first daughter and second-born child of Horatio Nelson Cook and Edith Scuffy Cook. She was born on November 28, 1873. She died on October 13, 1876. She was 2 years, 10 months, and 15 days old. Her funeral had taken place 2 days after her death. She had been buried in the family plot at Oddfellows Cemetery. And then, in the slow machinery of a city remaking itself, she had been left behind. Edith was not born into poverty or obscurity. Her family was prominent, successful, connected to the upper social circles of San Francisco. On her mother's side, her lineage reached back to the gold rush era. Her maternal grandfather, Peter Scuffy, had immigrated from Greece through New Orleans and eventually settled in San Francisco, where he worked as an oyster merchant. Her maternal grandmother, Martha Bradley, traced her ancestry to some of the earliest settlers of Virginia. Together, they had made a life in San Francisco during the city's most transformative years. On her father's side, Edith's paternal grandfather had come from England, her grandmother from Nova Scotia. Her father, Horatio Nelson Cook, was part of a family business, M.M. Cook & Son, focused on leather belting and hide tanning. After the death of his father, Horatio continued the work, eventually renaming the company H.N. Cook Belting. The business grew, lasted for generations, and eventually merged into new ownership in the 20th century. The Cook name carried weight in San Francisco. The family was known, respected, comfortable. None of that comfort could protect Edith. In the 19th century, wealth could not buy immunity from the diseases that swept through cities. San Francisco faced repeated outbreaks of diphtheria, cholera, and tuberculosis. Children died in large numbers, in rich families and poor ones alike. Edith's story was personal and specific and irreplaceable, but it was also part of a pattern, a larger tragedy shared by an entire era that had not yet learned how to keep its youngest members alive. Peter Cook, the living relative whose DNA provided the decisive match, had never imagined he would one day be connected to something like this. He had tried to trace his family history before and hit walls. Incomplete records. Missing branches. The discovery of Edith didn't just solve a mystery. It filled in decades of gaps in his family's lineage, tracing his ancestry back centuries further than he had been able to reach before. For him, it was not simply genealogy. It was the restoration of something he hadn't known was lost. When the identification was announced in 2017, the mystery was officially closed. Edith Howard Cook had her name back. She had her story. She had her place in history. But the resonance of her case goes beyond the forensic achievement. Impressive as that achievement was, the combination of ancient DNA analysis, stable isotope testing, and genealogical detective work that solved her case represents the kind of science that would have been impossible even a generation ago. Researchers didn't guess who she might have been. They proved it. Her case also became a reminder of how cities carry their histories in ways they don't always acknowledge or even know. San Francisco is built, literally, over its own past. The remains of thousands of people lie beneath its streets and neighborhoods, left behind in a relocation that was too large, too fast, and too imperfect to be truly complete. Edith is one of the ones who stayed. She is almost certainly not the only one. And then there is the simpler, more human dimension of what her discovery means. A small child died in 1876. Her parents dressed her carefully and placed flowers on her chest and sealed her in the best casket they could afford and said goodbye. They mourned her. And then time moved on, and the cemetery was relocated, and somehow she was missed, and the grief of her family was sealed along with her in that iron box, waiting underground while the world above changed completely. She was found at last. She was identified. She was given back her name and her story and her place in the long, complicated, imperfect record of human lives. And the science that gave those things back to her is one of the more quietly extraordinary things that has happened in a field full of extraordinary things. Edith Howard Cook was 2 years and 10 months old when she died. She had lived through a San Francisco winter and a San Francisco spring and had begun to understand, in whatever way very young children understand things, what the world was. She had parents who loved her. She had a family that would go on to build a legacy in a city she barely got to know. She deserved to be remembered. And now, finally, she is.